Can you imagine a woman who sacrificed her whole life for her son, selling every piece of jewelry, giving up every dream, working herself to exhaustion? And then one day, that very son sits down and calmly says, "You will always be last in my life." Not in anger, not accidentally, but deliberately, coldly. And that changed everything. This is the story of Eleanor Hayes, a 66-year-old woman who decided it was time to live for herself. Like, comment the city you're viewing so I know how far my story has come. And subscribe so you don't miss any parts. I used to believe that a mother's love was supposed to be bottomless. Not because anyone told me so, though plenty of people did, over the years, in greeting cards and Sunday afternoon advice, and the kind of well-meaning comments you smile through while your insides quietly disagree. I believed it because I lived it. Every single day for 40 years, I lived it so completely that I stopped being able to tell the difference between love and the slow erasure of myself. My name is Eleanor Hayes. I am 66 years old, and the morning everything finally broke open, I was standing in my kitchen making coffee I didn't particularly want, listening to the sound of my own breathing, and wondering how long a person can give everything away before there is simply nothing left to give. The answer, it turns out, is a very long time. Long enough to surprise even yourself. Caleb was born on a Tuesday in October, during a thunderstorm so loud it rattled the hospital windows. His father, Robert, held my hand so hard I thought he might break my fingers, and when they put that tiny screaming thing on my chest, I understood, completely, for the first time, what people meant when they said your whole world could change in an instant. Robert died 14 months later. Aneurysm. He was at the hardware store buying paint for the nursery he'd promised to finish over the weekend. He was 34 years old. He was supposed to come home for dinner. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that part of the story because I've spent enough years living inside it. What I will say is this. When Robert died, I made a decision. Not out loud, not formally, not even entirely consciously, but I made it all the same. I decided that Caleb was everything. That raising him well, protecting him, giving him every opportunity I possibly could, that was the reason I was still standing when everything else had fallen apart. That decision cost me more than I can calculate. I sold my mother's pearl earrings to cover the security deposit when we had to move to a smaller apartment. I turned down a promotion that would have required travel because I couldn't leave Caleb with a sitter 5 days a week. I dated exactly twice in the first decade after Robert died. A quiet accountant named Frank, who was perfectly kind and perfectly wrong, and a man whose name I no longer remember who wanted me to choose between him and my son on the third date. That one was easy. They all were. Caleb was a good kid. I want to make that clear because this story isn't about a child who was rotten from the beginning. He was curious and funny and sometimes infuriatingly stubborn in the way that reminded me exactly of his father, which would break my heart a little even when I was trying to be annoyed with him. He made me paper birthday cards until he was 13 because he thought store-bought ones were lazy. He called me every Sunday from college, without fail, even when I could tell he'd rather be doing something else. I thought we understood each other. I thought the sacrifices I made were invisible in the best possible way, absorbed into the fabric of a good life, rather than tallied up somewhere like a debt waiting to be called in. I was wrong about that. I was wrong about a lot of things. Her name was Vanessa Cho, and she came into Caleb's life when he was 28, like a weather system that changes the whole season. I want to be careful here, because I've done enough hard thinking about all of this to know that she is not the whole story. She is part of it, an important part, but the truth is more complicated than a simple villain, and I'm too old and too tired for simple stories. What I can tell you is what I observed. Vanessa was sharp and ambitious, and possessed of a very specific kind of confidence that I recognized from the corporate world, the kind that comes from never having been told no in any way that really counted. She had opinions about everything and expressed them freely, which I actually admired at first. I thought, here's a woman who knows her own mind. Maybe that's good for Caleb. Maybe that's exactly what he needs. What I didn't understand yet was that knowing your own mind and being open to anyone else's are not the same thing. The shift happened slowly, the way most shifts do. Not a sudden flood, but a steady drip, so gradual you barely notice until the water is already around your ankles. The first Christmas after they got serious, Caleb called to say they'd be spending the holidays with Vanessa's parents in Portland. Of course, I said. That makes sense. You're not upset? You have two families now. That's how it's supposed to work. I told myself that was generous. I told myself I meant it. Partly I did. But I also spent Christmas morning alone for the first time in 30 years. And I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a plate of cookies I'd made because habit is a powerful thing. And I watched the snow fall outside my window and felt something I couldn't quite name. Not grief exactly. Something quieter than grief. Something that felt like the first paragraph of a much longer sentence. They got married the following spring. I was seated in the fourth row. Vanessa's mother and grandmother were in the first two. Her aunts were in the third. When Caleb walked past me down the aisle to take his place, he caught my eye and smiled. And that smile was so genuinely happy that I swallowed everything else and smiled right back at him. I told myself, this is enough. His happiness is enough. I kept telling myself that for years. The invitations stopped arriving before I even realized they'd been happening. First, it was a dinner party at their house. Just her college friends, Mom. You wouldn't know anyone. Then a 4th of July barbecue. We kept it small this year. Then Caleb's birthday dinner. Vanessa planned it as a surprise. It was really just the two of them and her parents. I found out about that last one because I called to wish him a happy birthday and heard restaurant noise in the background and asked where he was. And there was a pause, just half a beat too long, before he told me. I didn't say anything about it. What was there to say? He was a grown man. He could have dinner with whoever he wanted on his birthday. But later, alone in my apartment, I counted backwards through the previous 18 months and realized I could not recall a single social event to which I had been invited. Family dinners at Vanessa's parents' house happened regularly. I knew this because Caleb mentioned them in passing, casually, the way you mention things you've forgotten to consider from someone else's perspective. Holiday gatherings, summer cookouts, a cousin's engagement party. Not once had anyone thought to include me. I told myself, maybe I'm too sensitive. Maybe this is just how modern families work. Maybe I need to stop keeping score. But the thing about telling yourself you're too sensitive is that it requires you to go on not being heard, and eventually that gets harder to do. Tick. The grandchildren question was where it got sharp. Caleb and Vanessa had a daughter, Lily, who was 4 years old and possessed of the kind of laugh that could make any room feel like sunlight had just walked in. I loved that little girl so fiercely, it was almost frightening. The particular terror of loving someone you are not allowed to fully access. Because that's what it had become. Access, measured and managed, dispensed in careful increments. Vanessa's mother, Helen, watched Lily every Tuesday and Thursday. She was at every birthday party, every school event, every casual Sunday visit. She knew Lily's favorite color, purple, then orange, then purple again. Her imaginary friend's name, Mopsy. The specific way she liked her grilled cheese cut, triangles, never squares. I knew these things too, but only because I asked. I was never just there to absorb them naturally. I was informed, the way you inform a distant relative who asks politely. My knowledge of my own granddaughter felt secondhand even when I was in the same room. When I raised it, gently, once, carefully choosing a moment when Caleb and I were alone, he looked at me with something between discomfort and impatience. Mom, Helen is retired. She's available. It makes logistical sense. I'm retired too, Caleb. It's different. How? He didn't answer that. He looked out the window and said he'd see what he could do, and then he didn't, and I let it go because letting it go had become its own kind of muscle memory. But it stayed with me. The word different. The way he'd said it, not cruelly, not even thoughtlessly, but with the tired certainty of someone repeating an internal logic they'd long since stopped questioning. Different. What a strange, heavy little word. I want to tell you about the money, because I know it's part of the picture, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. Over the 40 years since Robert died, I had contributed, in documented, trackable, concrete terms, somewhere in the neighborhood of $240,000 to Caleb's life. College tuition, because his scholarships didn't cover everything. A car when his broke down during his first year of work, because the bus route didn't reach his office. The down payment loan for their first home, not a gift, an agreed-upon loan that was to be repaid within 5 years, which eventually became 7, which eventually became a conversation I stopped having because it made Caleb go quiet and distant for days afterward. Medical bills during a rough patch when Vanessa had a procedure and their insurance was between plans. Emergency grocery runs, utility bills covered without comment during lean months, a new washer-dryer set that appeared on my credit card after a casual mention that theirs had broken. None of these things were spoken about openly. They happened in the spaces between conversations, in the practical urgencies of daily life, in the way that money moves through families when one person has it and another needs it, and love is supposed to be the reason no one keeps count. Except someone was keeping count. I just didn't know it at the time. And the number being counted wasn't dollars. The moment that changed everything happened on a Wednesday afternoon in late October, just after Lily's 5th birthday party, a party held at a venue I had not been invited to, at which I had not been present, which I had learned about through a photograph Caleb texted me the following morning showing Lily covered in cake frosting and beaming. I had texted back, "She looks so happy. I would have loved to be there." There was a long pause before his reply. Then, "Can you come over tomorrow? Vanessa and I want to talk to you about something." That pause. I should have paid more attention to that pause. I arrived at their house at 2 in the afternoon. Vanessa made tea. They sat across from me at their kitchen table, their nice kitchen table, the one I had quietly helped pay for. And the body language told me everything before a single word was spoken. Caleb had his hands flat on the table, the way he used to when he was about to tell me something he didn't want to say. Vanessa had her arms crossed lightly, not defensively, just contained, prepared. "We wanted to be honest with you," Caleb began. "I have learned in 66 years that sentences beginning with that particular phrase are almost never actually about honesty. They are about someone needing to say something difficult and using the word honest as a kind of preemptive moral armor." "All right," I said. "We feel like—" He looked at Vanessa. She gave him a small encouraging nod. "We feel like the dynamic between us hasn't been what it should be. And we've talked about it a lot, and we've decided it's better to just say it clearly." "I appreciate that," I said. My hands were folded in my lap. I was aware of the sound of the refrigerator humming. "Say it clearly, then." Caleb met my eyes. His jaw was set. There was something in his expression I couldn't quite read. Not guilt, not exactly. Something closer to resolution, like a man who has finally gotten around to a difficult errand. "Vanessa's family will always come first," he said. "That's just the reality of our life. Her parents, her siblings, they're our primary family unit. And I think you've had certain expectations that don't match that reality. And it's not fair to either side to keep pretending otherwise." The refrigerator hummed. A car went past outside. Somewhere in the house, a clock ticked. I looked at my son, this person I had carried into the world during a thunderstorm, this person for whom I had sold my mother's earrings and turned down promotions and spent Christmas alone and cut my own needs down to almost nothing, and I waited to feel something enormous. The devastation I had always feared, the collapse I had quietly been bracing against for years. What I felt instead was very strange. It was almost like relief. Not because I wasn't hurt. I was. I am. There is a kind of pain that sits so deep inside you that it stops feeling like an event and starts feeling like weather, and that is what this was. But underneath the pain was something else. A sudden, startling clarity. The kind you only get when something you've been half-knowing for years is finally said out loud. "And where does that leave me?" I asked. My voice was completely steady. Even I was surprised by that. Vanessa spoke for the first time. "We still want you in Lily's life," she said. "We're not trying to cut you out. We just think it's important that you understand your role." Your role. Like a part in a play that someone else has written. Like a function. Like a supporting character in your own child's story. "I appreciate you telling me," I said. And I meant it. I genuinely meant it. Because the worst thing about the previous 10 years was not the exclusion or the distance or the slow diminishment. It was the uncertainty. The constant wondering whether I was imagining it, reading too much into silences, being too sensitive, expecting too much. They had just removed that uncertainty entirely. They had handed me, in the plainest possible language, a map of exactly where I stood. You'll always be last, Caleb added, as if this needed to be underscored. I'm sorry if that's hard to hear. I nodded once. I stood up. I smoothed my coat, a habit, smoothing things down. And I looked at my son for a long moment, the way you look at a place you're about to leave for the last time, committing it to memory. Thank you for the tea, I said. And then I walked out. What? The drive home took 22 minutes. I know because I noticed the clock when I got in the car, and again when I pulled into my building's garage, and there it was. 22 minutes during which the world rearranged itself into an entirely new configuration. I didn't cry in the car. I didn't cry when I got upstairs either, or when I made myself a real dinner instead of the tea and crackers that had become my sad habit on difficult evenings. I sat at my kitchen table, my own kitchen table, in my own space, and ate chicken and roasted vegetables, and I thought. I thought about 40 years. I thought about what 40 years of giving looks like from the outside. A woman who handled things. A mother who showed up. A quiet resource, available and dependable, called upon in emergencies and set aside in prosperity. I thought about what 40 years of giving looks like from the inside. The slow, steady subtraction of yourself. The way you stop articulating your own needs because they keep getting lost anyway, so why spend the breath? The way you stop planning things for yourself because plans require believing your time has value, and you've spent so long treating your time as surplus to be donated that the belief has simply worn away. I thought about all the things I had not done. Not great things, not dramatic things, small things. A pottery class I'd seen advertised and thought, maybe someday. A trip to South America I'd bookmarked on my computer and never booked because something always needed the money more. Books I'd wanted to read. A garden I'd wanted to grow. A version of myself I had packed carefully away when Robert died, planning to return to her later, and then simply never had. And then I thought about what Caleb had said. You'll always be last. Here's the thing I discovered sitting at my kitchen table at 6:45 on a Wednesday evening. Being told you are last is devastating. It is also, in a very strange and unexpected way, liberating. Because if you have already been assigned to last place, if that position has been established, confirmed, stated plainly by the person whose opinion of you you spent 4 decades trying to secure, then there is nothing left to lose. The fear of losing something is the thing that keeps you small, and that fear had just been removed from the equation. I was already last. I had been last for years without knowing it. The only difference now was that I knew, which meant I could stop trying to move up the list, which meant I could stop organizing my life around a ranking I would never be permitted to improve, which meant, for the first time since Robert died in a hardware store on a Saturday afternoon 40 years ago, I could start thinking about what I actually wanted. I didn't sleep much that night, not from grief, or not only from grief, but from a kind of restless energy I hadn't felt in so long I'd forgotten what it was. At 3 a.m, I got up, made chamomile tea I also didn't particularly want, and sat at my desk with a legal pad and a pen. I started writing. Not a letter, not a list of grievances or an accounting of what I'd given and what I hadn't received in return. I wrote a different kind of list. Things I want. It sounds simple. It is not simple. 66 years old, and sitting down to answer that question, honestly was one of the hardest things I had done in recent memory, because I had spent so long organizing my wants around other people's needs that I had lost the grammar of my own desire. I didn't know how to want things in the first person anymore. I kept starting sentences that turned into something about Caleb or Lily or what would be convenient for someone else, and I'd have to catch myself and pull the thought back. What do I want? I wrote slowly at first, then faster. A smaller house. My own house, not an apartment where the walls carry the sound of other people's lives, but somewhere with a little space, a little quiet, maybe a garden. My apartment was fully paid for. I had owned it outright for 11 years. It was worth a good deal more than it had been when I bought it. Security that belongs to me, not savings that could be quietly called on in an emergency. Real financial independence. Money invested and working and producing something for my future rather than sitting in a checking account waiting to be redirected towards someone else's crisis. Time that is mine. Real time. not the leftover hours after I've finished being available. People who are glad to see me, who invite me to things, who don't need me to justify my presence. I wrote for an hour and a half. When I finally set the pen down, my hand ached, and the tea was cold, and the page was nearly full. And I felt something I had not felt in so long that it took me a moment to recognize it. I felt like myself. I called my oldest friend Miriam the next morning. Miriam Okafor had known me since we were both 22 years old and working the same double shifts at the same downtown restaurant, splitting a booth at 2 a.m. over plates of fries we ate because we were too tired to find anything better. She had been at Robert's funeral. She had watched me build a life around my son, the way you watch someone construct something elaborate and slightly precarious, with a mix of admiration and private concern. When I told her what Caleb had said, there was a silence on her end that was not the silence of someone searching for words. It was the silence of someone who already had the words and was deciding whether this was finally the moment to say them. "Eleanor," she said, "how much of your apartment's equity have you actually looked at? Recently?" "I know what it's worth, Miriam." "And what are you going to do with it?" "That's what I want to talk to you about." Another pause. Then quietly, fiercely. "Finally." I spent the next 3 weeks meeting with people. My financial advisor, a precise and patient woman named Sandra, who had been gently suggesting for years that I think more seriously about my own long-term planning rather than assuming my son would eventually factor into it. "I'm glad you're doing this," she said, in a tone that made it clear she had been waiting a while. A real estate agent named Tom, who walked me through my apartment with the professional detachment of someone assessing value rather than history, which was, in that moment, exactly what I needed. A property consultant who showed me 3 different smaller homes, a word I use loosely. What I mean is spaces built for one life, sized for one person's actual needs rather than the ghost of a family that had never quite assembled the way I'd imagined. And Miriam, repeatedly, over coffee and then more coffee, who sat across from me and listened while I talked my way through everything I was thinking and asked sharp questions and occasionally said things I didn't want to hear, and was right every single time. The decision came together the way good decisions do, not in a single moment of clarity, but in a gradual convergence, each conversation adding weight to a direction I'd already started moving. I was going to sell the apartment. I was going to buy something smaller, something mine in a way that couldn't be negotiated or mortgaged or redirected. I was going to invest the difference, properly, with guidance for my own future. I was going to stop being a resource and start being a person. I made an appointment with Tom to discuss listing the apartment. On the way home from that meeting, I drove past the community center 3 blocks from my building, the one with the sign I'd read 100 times and never stopped for. Ceramics, watercolor, book groups, fitness classes, garden club, community events. I had driven past that sign for 9 years. I pulled over. I parked the car. I went inside. The woman at the desk looked up. "I'd like to sign up for a few things," I said. She smiled and slid a brochure across the counter. "Welcome in," she said. "What are you interested in?" I looked down at the brochure, at the list of classes and clubs and groups of people gathering around shared things, at all the choices laid out on a single page. "I'm not entirely sure yet," I said, honestly. And for the first time in a very long time, not knowing felt less like being lost and more like standing at the beginning of something. I took the brochure home. That night, I called Caleb. The phone rang 4 times. His voicemail picked up. I sat with the phone in my hand for a moment, listening to his recorded voice asking me to leave a message. I didn't leave one. There was nothing left to say. Not tonight. Not like this. Not into an empty recording. Whatever conversation came next would need to happen face-to-face when I was ready, which was not yet. I set the phone down on the table beside my legal pad, still covered in the things I wanted. Outside my window, the city carried on. And somewhere inside the life I had spent 40 years building around someone else, a door that had been quietly sealed for a very long time was just beginning to open. The brochure stayed on my kitchen table for 4 days before I did anything with it. I'm not proud of that. I'd like to tell you that I marched into that community center, signed up for 3 classes, and walked out feeling like a new woman. But that's not how any of this actually worked. What actually happened was that I picked it up every morning with my coffee, looked at it, set it back down, and then went about my day feeling vaguely like a person standing at the edge of a diving board they hadn't yet decided to use. The hesitation embarrassed me. I was 66 years old. I had navigated widowhood and single parenthood and 40 years of quietly holding things together. I had just walked out of my son's kitchen after being told, plainly and without apology, that I ranked last in his life. I had made a legal pad full of decisions I actually intended to keep, and I was afraid of a pottery class. But here is what I've learned about fear. It is almost never about the thing it claims to be about. I wasn't afraid of clay or kilns or making something ugly on my first try. I was afraid of wanting things for myself and having that want feel foolish. I had spent so long treating my own needs as secondary, as postponed, as the thing that would happen after everything else was handled, that reaching towards something purely for my own pleasure felt almost transgressive, like I was doing something I hadn't earned the right to do yet. It took Miriam calling me on a Thursday morning to finally move me. "Did you sign up for anything at that center?" she asked, before I even said hello. "I'm thinking about it. Eleanor, I'm seriously considering. I'm going to come over there and sign you up myself if you don't do it today." She would have too. That's the thing about Miriam. She doesn't make threats. She doesn't intend to follow through on, and she had a very specific look she got when she'd run out of patience with someone she loved, and I had been on the receiving end of it enough times to know I didn't want it pointed at me right now. "Fine," I said. "Today. Call me when it's done." I called her 40 minutes later from the parking lot of the community center, having just registered for Tuesday morning ceramics, a Thursday evening book group, and, in a moment of genuine boldness that surprised even me, an 8-week watercolor workshop starting in November. "3 things?" She sounded delighted. "Don't make it weird." "I'm not making it weird. I'm being proud of you." "Stop." "I'm not stopping. This is me being proud of you, and you're going to have to tolerate it." I sat in the car for another few minutes after I hung up, watching people go in and out of the community center. Older women in comfortable shoes, a man in his 70s with a canvas bag, a young couple with a toddler who was apparently extremely interested in a crack in the sidewalk. Ordinary people living ordinary Thursday mornings. I thought, I can do this. I can be an ordinary person on an ordinary Thursday morning. I drove home and called Tom, my real estate agent. "Let's list it," I said. Selling the apartment was harder than I expected, and not for the reasons I'd anticipated. I'd thought the hard part would be financial, the paperwork, the negotiations, the logistics of moving my life from one place to another. And those things were genuinely tedious, the kind of administrative undertaking that requires you to locate documents you haven't looked at in years and answer questions that make you feel like you're being tested on your own biography. But I'd handled complicated logistics before. That part I knew how to do. What I hadn't expected was what it would feel like to walk through my own apartment with a photographer, watching him arrange my furniture for pictures that would be posted online, turning the place where I had lived for 21 years into a product. I followed him from room to room, and I kept stopping on small things. The mark on the doorframe where I'd tracked Caleb's height until he was 13 and told me to stop because it was embarrassing. The slightly uneven baseboard in the second bedroom that Robert had been meaning to fix and never did. The window in the kitchen that faced west and caught the light on late afternoons in a way that had always made the room feel like something out of a painting I'd never gotten around to buying. I was not sentimental about the apartment itself exactly. It was a building, walls, a place to sleep. But it was also the container for a very specific chapter of my life. The chapter of raising Caleb, of being a mother above all other things, of organizing every cubic foot of my existence around someone else's needs. Walking out of that chapter required actually walking out. And that, it turned out, was not nothing. The apartment sold in 11 days. The offer came in above asking, which Sandra had told me was possible, but which still managed to feel slightly surreal when Tom called to tell me. I sat down on my sofa, which would be going to Miriam's nephew, who'd just gotten his first apartment, and I looked at the number on the paper he'd emailed over, and I thought about what that number represented. It represented 40 years of working, It represented every double shift and every skipped vacation and every small want I'd set aside. It represented the security deposit I'd scraped together from almost nothing at 31 years old, moving into this building with a toddler and 2 suitcases and a very specific kind of determination that I had forgotten I was capable of. It also represented what came next. Sandra and I met the following week and spent 2 hours going through options with the focus of people doing something that genuinely matters. I'm not going to walk through every detail of what we decided because this isn't a story about financial strategy. It's a story about a woman learning to treat her own future as worth protecting. What I will say is that by the time I walked out of Sandra's office, there was money working for me. Not sitting in an account waiting to be needed. Working, growing. Building something that was mine in a way nothing had been mine in a very long time. I found the new house on a Saturday, 3 weeks into my search. It was smaller than what I'd had, not dramatically smaller, but deliberately so. 1 proper bedroom, a second room I could use however I wanted, a kitchen with real counter space, and a backyard that was mostly overgrown but had good bones, as the property consultant had said, meaning it was structurally sound but needed someone to decide what it should become. I thought I knew something about that. It had a covered porch in the front and a linden tree in the backyard that dropped yellow leaves all over the neglected grass and was apparently very old and not going anywhere. I stood under it on the viewing and looked up through the branches at the October sky, and something settled in my chest. Not happiness, not yet, but the precursor to happiness. The quiet recognition of a place where happiness might become possible. "I'll take it," I told the consultant. She blinked. "Don't you want to see the second bathroom?" "I'm sure it's fine." It was fine. The whole thing was fine. It was mine. I moved in on a Friday in early November, with Miriam and her husband Calvin and 2 young men from a moving company who were politely baffled by how little furniture I was bringing. "This is it?" one of them asked, looking at the pile in the apartment lobby. "That's it," I said. "You want us to take the rest to storage, or the rest is gone?" This is what I kept. What I kept was simple. My bed, my desk, 2 bookshelves, my grandmother's rocking chair that had been in every home I'd ever lived in, the kitchen table I'd bought for myself 5 years ago that I actually liked, and a collection of small things with genuine meaning. A photograph of Robert from before we were married, a drawing Lily had made me when she was 3 that I couldn't bring myself to set aside regardless of everything else. What I did not keep, the dining table large enough for 8, which no one had ever sat around, which I had owned in case of family dinners that never materialized, the guest room furniture, the second sofa, an entire closet's worth of stored items that turned out to be, upon actual examination, objects I'd been unable to throw away rather than things I actually wanted. Miriam and I stood in the new kitchen that evening, takeout containers open on the counter, Calvin asleep on my grandmother's rocking chair in the living room because he'd done most of the heavy lifting and earned it. And she looked around at the stripped-down simplicity of what I'd built and said, "How does it feel?" I thought about it honestly. "Terrifying," I said. "And right." "Yeah," she said. "That tracks." The ceramics class met on Tuesday mornings in a low-lit room that smelled of damp earth and the particular mineral sharpness of kiln heat, and it was taught by a woman named Greta, who was somewhere in her late 50s, wore her gray hair in a long braid, and had the patient, slightly amused manner of someone who had watched many beginners destroy many pieces of clay and had concluded this was a perfectly acceptable part of the process. My first attempt at centering clay on the wheel was genuinely embarrassing. The clay wobbled, then it listed dramatically to one side. Then it flew off the wheel entirely and hit the work table with a damp thud that made the woman next to me flinch. "That happens," Greta said, appearing at my elbow. "To everyone?" "To everyone who's being honest about it." She replaced the clay for me, calm as anything. "Try again. Put your whole weight into it. Don't be polite with it." Don't be polite with it. I turned that over in my head while I worked my hands back into the clay, pressing harder than felt natural, finding the resistance and pushing through it. There was something about the instruction that landed differently than Greta had probably intended. I had been polite with everything for 40 years. Polite with my own grief. Polite with my own anger. Polite with the slow, steady diminishment of my place in my son's life, treating each new exclusion as something to accept graciously rather than something to name and refuse. The clay centered, not perfectly. It was still slightly off, slightly imperfect, with a wobble I couldn't quite correct. But it held. It held its shape under my hands. I pressed on. The woman next to me, I learned, was named Patricia. She was 63, recently retired from a 30-year career in public school administration, and she had the particular combination of exhaustion and giddiness that I recognized from my own recent weeks. The look of someone who had spent a long time being very busy on other people's behalf and was only now beginning to understand what to do with themselves. "My daughter keeps asking when I'm getting a part-time job," Patricia said, her hands working their own piece of clay. "Like retirement is a problem to be solved." "Mine tells me I'm last on his list of priorities," I said, before I'd quite decided to. Patricia looked at me. Her hands kept moving. "Well," she said, "I guess we're both starting from the same place." We went out for coffee after class. The following Tuesday, we did it again. By the third week, it had become the kind of easy, unspoken habit that forms between people who recognize something true in each other without needing to discuss exactly what it is. The book group met Thursday evenings in a back room of the public library, and it turned out to be one of those particular pleasures I had not allowed myself to anticipate because I'd been afraid of being disappointed. It was not disappointing. It was a group of 9 people, mostly women, one man named Harold, who read everything twice and had opinions about everything once, and was completely insufferable in the best possible way, who gathered around folding tables every week and argued passionately about characters in novels, as if those characters' choices had personal implications, which I suppose they always do. I had forgotten what it felt like to have a real conversation about something that wasn't practical. Not a conversation about logistics or money or what someone needed from me, but a conversation about ideas, about what a story meant, about whether a character's decision was cowardly or brave, or both at once. I had forgotten the particular pleasure of people who genuinely wanted to hear what I thought. The first night, we were discussing a novel I'd actually read years ago and half remembered. The main character was a woman who had spent 20 years in a marriage that slowly reduced her, and the book's central question was whether her eventual decision to leave was liberation or abandonment of her responsibilities. Harold, predictably, thought it was abandonment. "She made commitments," he said. "Commitments don't evaporate because you become unhappy." "She became invisible," said a woman across the table, small, sharp-eyed, named Joyce, who turned out to be 71 and had survived 2 husbands and 3 corporate mergers and had thoughts about everything. "There's a difference between unhappy and erased." "The character doesn't leave because she's unhappy," I said, and everyone looked at me. The new one, still unknown, still being assessed. "She leaves because she finally realizes that staying has become a form of self-destruction. Those are different problems requiring different solutions." A silence. Then Joyce pointed at me and said, "Her, I like her." I came back the following Thursday, and the one after that. The calls from Caleb during this period were infrequent and oddly formal, like correspondence between people who have recently renegotiated a business arrangement and haven't quite settled into the new terms yet. He called once in mid-November on a Sunday evening. I was in my backyard raking leaves, my yard, my leaves, my muddy boots, and I answered with dirt on one glove and the rake balanced against my hip. "Mom, how are you?" "Good," I said, which was true, and which I could tell surprised him slightly by the half-beat pause that followed. "I heard you sold the apartment." News traveled through families faster than you'd expect, even families in the process of quietly reconfiguring. I wondered briefly who had told him. Miriam? His cousin Patricia, whom I'd run into at the market last week? And then decided it didn't particularly matter. "I did," I said. "Where are you living?" "I bought a house, smaller. It has a linden tree." Another pause. "Mom, He stopped, started again. "I wanted to make sure you were okay. After our conversation." The conversation. I noticed the phrasing, the careful, distanced noun that turned what he'd said to me across his kitchen table into a neutral, shared event rather than what it actually was. "I'm fine, Caleb," I said. And I meant that too. "I'm genuinely fine." "You don't sound angry." "I'm not, particularly." I looked at the pile of leaves I'd been building, yellow and orange, and that specific rust color that linden trees go in November, heaped against the fence in a way that was deeply satisfying for no reason I could fully articulate. I think you told me the truth. I think I needed to hear it. He was quiet for a moment. That's not what I expected you to say. I know. What did you do with the money from the apartment? I almost laughed. Not meanly, just at the particular directness of it, the way the question surfaced, so quickly, like something that had been waiting just beneath the surface of the pleasantries. I took care of my future, I said. That's all. Mom, I have to finish the yard before it gets dark, Caleb. I'm glad you called. I hung up and went back to raking. He didn't call again for 3 weeks, and when he did, it was brief and surface level, and I was pleasant and present and entirely myself. And I think that confused him more than anything else I could have done. What nobody tells you about choosing yourself after years of choosing everyone else is that it doesn't feel triumphant. Not at first. It feels, strange, off balance, like you've been walking with one leg slightly shorter than the other for so long that the corrected stride feels wrong even though it's right. I caught myself, in those first weeks, doing things that startled me. Buying the more expensive olive oil without doing math in my head about whether I could afford it. Staying in the ceramic studio an extra hour after class because I wanted to, because Greta said I could, because no one was waiting for me and I didn't need to rush toward any obligation. Making plans for myself, not elaborate plans, but concrete ones, real ones. The kind of plans that assumed my time had value and my pleasure counted as a legitimate use of it. I also caught myself reaching for the phone to call Caleb at odd moments, the way you reach for something that used to be in a certain pocket and isn't anymore. The habit of checking in, the habit of measuring my own day partly by whether he knew about it. I didn't call every time I reached for the phone. Sometimes I did. The genuine calls, the ones where there was something real to say. But I stopped calling just to make contact, just to maintain a thread I'd come to realize he wasn't holding from the other end. That was harder than I want to admit. Love is not a rational thing. You can understand completely and without ambiguity that someone has treated you as less than you are worth. You can know it intellectually, articulate it clearly, make concrete decisions based on it, and you can still love them. You can still feel the pull of the connection, still carry the particular grief of watching someone be less than you hoped they'd be. Those two things don't cancel each other out. They just coexist, uncomfortably, the way difficult true things often do. What changed was not whether I loved Caleb. What changed was whether that love got to govern my life. It didn't anymore. That was the decision. Not a revenge, not a punishment, not a dramatic cutting off of ties. Just a quiet reprioritization. My life was mine, my resources were mine, my future was mine to build and protect. And loving my son did not require me to hollow myself out in service of a relationship that had repeatedly demonstrated it would not hollow itself out for me. That sounds clean. It wasn't clean, but it was true. And I held on to true things in those months the way you hold on to a railing in the dark, not gracefully, but firmly, because it's what keeps you from going down. The first weekend in December, I booked a flight. Not a long trip, 5 days during the holiday stretch that had become its own kind of dreaded milestone since Caleb and Vanessa had established Portland as their Christmas destination. 5 days in New Orleans, a city I had always wanted to visit and never had, because there had always been some reason not to, some claim on the money or the time or the permission I apparently needed to give myself. I booked a hotel that was slightly nicer than strictly necessary. I made a list of things I wanted to eat. I downloaded 3 books onto my phone for the flights and felt, in doing so, the particular uncomplicated pleasure of anticipating something purely for myself. Patricia from ceramics class reacted the way I'd hoped someone would. New Orleans, she said, holding her coffee cup with both hands and looking at me with an expression that was equal parts delight and envy. Alone? Alone. How does that feel? I thought about it. Like something I should have done 20 years ago, I said, but also exactly the right time. She raised her cup. To exactly the right time. I raised mine. Caleb called on a Thursday, 12 days before I was supposed to leave. I almost didn't answer. I was in the middle of a book group discussion about a novel set in Buenos Aires, and Harold was in the middle of an argument with Joyce that I was very much enjoying. But I saw his name on the screen and stepped out into the hallway. "Mom, I need to talk to you." Something in his voice had changed. The careful, managed distance that had characterized the last several weeks was gone. In its place was something raw, something I hadn't heard from him in a long time, something that sounded like worry. "What's happened?" I said. "Can you come over tomorrow? I know it's short notice, but..." "What's happened, Caleb?" A pause that lasted several seconds, long enough that I moved further down the hallway, away from the sound of the book group debate filtering under the door. "The business," he said finally. "There are some problems with the business." He and Vanessa had launched a retail venture 18 months ago. A boutique concept with a brick-and-mortar location and an online component, funded partly by a small business loan and partly by private investment from Vanessa's father, which had always struck me as an arrangement with more complexity than anyone had fully acknowledged. I had heard about the venture mostly in passing, in the way Caleb shared positive news with me and omitted the rest. "How serious?" I asked. Another pause. Longer this time. "Pretty serious," he said. I stood in that hallway with the library carpet under my feet and the sound of Joyce winning an argument about Argentine literature audible through the door, and I felt something shift, not inside me but around me, a change in the air, the particular pressure drop that precedes a storm. "I'll call you tomorrow morning," I said. "We'll figure out when we can talk." "Mom, tomorrow, Caleb." I went back into the book group. Harold and Joyce had moved on to the novel's ending, which Harold found unsatisfying, and Joyce declared the only honest conclusion possible. I sat back down and picked up my copy and found my place and said, "I'm with Joyce on this one," and meant it. But on the drive home, I thought about that pause, the rawness in his voice, the way he'd said pretty serious with the particular flatness of someone who means much worse than the words suggest. I pulled into my driveway, under the bare branches of the linden tree, and sat in the car for a moment. Whatever was coming, I was not the same woman who had driven home from Caleb's kitchen 6 weeks ago, wondering how long a person could keep giving before there was nothing left. I was also not, I realized, afraid of what he was about to ask. For the first time in a very long time, I knew exactly where I stood. I knew what I had, what it was for, and what I would and would not do with it. And whatever he was about to need from me, I already knew one thing with the quiet, unmovable certainty of a woman who has recently learned the weight of her own spine. This time, I would not be answering from last place. He called again at 7:45 the next morning before I'd finished my first cup of coffee. I had slept poorly, not from dread exactly, but from that particular restless alertness that comes when you know something is approaching and your body refuses to fully stand down. I'd been awake since 5, watching the gray December light come up slowly through my bedroom window, listening to the linden tree move in the wind outside, running through possible versions of the conversation ahead, the way you rehearse for something you can't fully prepare for. When his name appeared on my phone screen, I let it ring twice before I answered, not out of cruelty, out of the simple, new habit of not lunging for things anymore. "Morning," I said. "Mom." His voice was tight. "Can you come over today? I know I said tomorrow, but can you come today? I have ceramics this morning until noon." A pause that communicated very clearly that he found this surprising and somewhat inconvenient. "Afternoon, then," he said. 2:00, I said. "I'll be there at 2." I went to ceramics. I centered my clay. I stayed for the full session, and I did not rush. They were both home when I arrived. That was the first signal. Vanessa was usually at her studio space on Friday afternoons, managing inventory, taking meetings. The fact that she was sitting in the living room when Caleb opened the door told me, without a word being spoken, that this conversation had been organized, prepared for. That whatever they were about to say, they had discussed it between themselves first and arrived at a unified position. I recognized the formation. It was the same one they'd used in October. The difference was that this time, when I sat down across from them, I was not the same woman who had sat in that kitchen 8 weeks ago, not yet knowing how far she had already fallen in her son's estimation. The living room looked the same as always, the furniture I'd helped choose, the rug I'd helped pay for, the framed prints on the walls that Vanessa had selected and that I had pretended to find more interesting than I did. Everything in its place, everything composed, except for the two people sitting across from me who looked like they hadn't slept particularly well either. Caleb looked older than I remembered, which is what stress does to a face when it's been working on it for a while without the person acknowledging it. There were shadows under his eyes that weren't new, but were deeper. Vanessa had her hands folded in her lap with the careful stillness of someone managing a great deal beneath the surface. "Tell me what's happening," I said. I didn't reach for pleasantries. We were past pleasantries. Caleb exhaled. "The business is in serious trouble," he said. "We've been dealing with it for about 4 months, but it got a lot worse in the last 6 weeks. We lost our 2 biggest wholesale accounts back to back, and then the holiday inventory we pre-ordered didn't move the way we projected, so we're sitting on product we can't liquidate fast enough to cover the payments coming due in January." "How much?" I asked. He glanced at Vanessa. She gave him a small nod, the same nod she'd given him in October, the signal to proceed with the planned thing. "Between the business loan and the inventory financing and what we owe Vanessa's father—" He stopped, started again. "Somewhere between $100,000 and $120,000. That we need to cover by the end of January or we're in default on the loan, which triggers everything else." The number sat in the room between us. $120,000. I looked at my son's face. I looked at Vanessa's carefully composed expression. I waited to feel something overwhelming, panic or guilt or the old reflex, the deep-grooved muscle memory of being the person who solves things, who covers deficits, who makes the hard thing go away by absorbing it into herself. What I felt instead was very quiet and very clear. "What is it you're asking me?" I said. Another glance between them. Caleb leaned forward. "We were thinking, if you could mortgage the apartment or use it as collateral against a loan, it would give us enough to cover January and buy time to restructure. And then when the business stabilizes, we could pay you back, obviously. This isn't—" "Caleb," I said. He stopped. "I sold the apartment." The silence that followed was different from the ordinary kind. It was the specific silence of people who have walked into a room they were absolutely certain existed and found a wall where they expected a door. Vanessa's composure cracked, just slightly, a tightening around her eyes, a fractional shift in her posture. "You sold it," Caleb repeated. 8 weeks ago, I told you this. You said you'd moved. I didn't—" He ran a hand through his hair. "I didn't realize you'd actually sold it. I thought maybe you rented it out or—" "I sold it, Caleb. I told you I bought a house." "But the apartment, Mom, that apartment was worth—" "I know what it was worth," I said. "I'm the one who owned it." What happened next was not, to be fair to Caleb, an immediate explosion. He is not a man who explodes easily, which is both one of his better qualities and, I have come to understand, one of the ways he avoids reckoning with things. He went very still instead, the way he had as a child when he was trying to process something that didn't fit his understanding of the world. Vanessa was less still. "Where did the money go?" she asked. Her voice was even and controlled, which somehow made the question sharper rather than softer. "I invested it," I said, "for my retirement." "All of it?" "The majority of it, yes. What I didn't invest went toward the house." "So you have a house and investments," Vanessa said. "Which means you have assets." I looked at her directly. "I have security," I said. "Which is a different thing." "Eleanor," she leaned forward slightly. "I understand you wanted to make changes, and I understand why, given the conversation we had in October, but this is a crisis. This is Caleb's business. This is your son." "I'm aware he's my son," I said. "Then you understand that we're talking about a situation that could affect his credit, his livelihood, Lily's stability." "Vanessa," I kept my voice level, "I need you to hear me clearly. I don't have $120,000 in accessible cash. I have a home I live in and investments that exist to fund my retirement. not as emergency collateral for business decisions I wasn't consulted on and didn't participate in. The word consulted landed. I saw it land. Caleb looked up from his hands. We didn't ask you to participate because it wasn't your business, he said, and then caught how that sounded. I mean, it was our venture, our decision. It was, I agreed, and this is the consequence of that decision, which is also yours. He stared at me. Are you seriously? Mom, are you saying you won't help us? I'm saying I can't give you what I don't have in a form that can be given, I said. And I'm saying that even if I could, I would need to think very carefully about whether it's the right thing. It's your son, Vanessa said again, and this time the evenness in her voice had a sharper quality underneath it, like a floor that has started to give. I know who he is, I said. I've known who he is for 40 years. I'm the one who raised him. Here is where things got worse. I had expected pushback. I had expected disappointment, frustration, the discomfort of saying no to people who were used to hearing yes from me. What I had not fully anticipated was the speed with which the conversation shifted, not gradually, not through escalating argument, but in a single pivot that felt almost rehearsed, as if this too had been discussed and prepared for. Vanessa sat back. She looked at me for a moment with an expression I hadn't seen from her before. Not the composed management of her usual presentation, but something rawer and less calculated. She was genuinely upset. Genuinely desperate, maybe, in the way that people who have never had to genuinely reckon with the consequences of their choices look when those consequences finally arrive. Do you understand what you're doing? She said. Do you understand what it's going to mean for Lily if we lose everything? Lily. There it was. I had been waiting for it, not because it was manipulative, or not only because it was, but because I understood that when people are drowning, they reach for whatever is closest. And Vanessa knew, had always known, that Lily was the handhold most likely to bring me to my knees. I breathed through it. I thought about my granddaughter's laugh. I thought about the drawing on my refrigerator. I thought about all the birthday parties and school events and ordinary Tuesdays I had been absent from while Vanessa's mother sat in the front row of Lily's life. Lily's stability is something I think about, I said carefully. It's why I hope you find a way through this. But Lily's stability is not my financial responsibility. It's yours and Caleb's. That's easy to say when you're sitting on a pile of money we could use right now. Vanessa, Caleb's voice warning. She stopped, looked at him. Something moved between them, some private marital recalibration, and then she pressed her lips together and looked away. Caleb turned back to me. When he spoke, his voice had dropped, and some of the controlled distance had gone out of it. What was left was something that resembled, uncomfortably, his voice at about 12 years old, when something had gone wrong at school, and he was trying very hard not to show how scared he was. Mom, he said, please, I'm asking you, please. Oh, that word, please, in that voice. After 40 years of responding to that voice, I sat with it. I didn't look away from him. I let myself feel the full weight of what he was asking and what it cost him to ask it. And I also let myself feel, underneath that, the full weight of what they had said to me 8 weeks ago at the same table. The careful, deliberate clarity with which my son had told me I would always be last. You do not get to tell someone they are last and then call them first when the fire starts. Caleb, I said quietly, do you remember what you told me in October? He looked down. You told me that Vanessa's family would always come first, that I would always be last. I paused. I thanked you for being honest, and I meant it, because it helped me understand something I'd been refusing to see for a long time. Mom, I'm not finished. I kept my voice even. I had practiced this, in a way, not the specific words, but the steadiness. I had been practicing steadiness for 8 weeks. I reorganized my life based on what you told me. I sold my apartment. I secured my future. I made decisions for myself for the first time in decades, and I did all of that specifically because you made it clear that I should not be counting on being valued, considered, or prioritized by you. The room was very quiet. That wasn't, Mom, I didn't mean it as a... I was trying to be honest about our situation. You were honest, I said. I'm being honest now. People who are placed last cannot be expected to arrive first in an emergency. That's not cruelty. That's just the arithmetic of what you told me. Vanessa made a sound. Not quite a word. Not quite. Not a word. Something that might have been disbelief or might have been the beginning of an argument she hadn't assembled yet. So that's it, Caleb said. His voice cracked slightly on the last word. You're going to let us lose everything because of one conversation? I'm not letting you do anything, I said. I'm not the author of this situation, Caleb. You and Vanessa made business decisions. They didn't work out. That is genuinely painful, and I am genuinely sorry for it. But I did not create this problem, and I am not in a position to erase it. And even if I were, I stopped, breathed, said the true thing. Even if I were, doing so would leave me with nothing, no security, no future, nothing to stand on. And I am 66 years old, and I will not do that again. Again. I heard the word as I said it. So did he. Caleb looked at me for a long moment. His jaw was tight. His eyes were bright in the way that means something is being held back, and I wasn't certain what. You've changed, he said. Yes, I said. I have. I drove home in the rain. It was the specific kind of December rain that isn't quite cold enough to be interesting. Not sleet, not snow, just wet and gray and persistent. The kind of weather that asks nothing dramatic of you and simply makes everything slightly harder. I drove carefully, both hands on the wheel, the heater running, the windshield wipers keeping their steady time. I had not cried in the meeting. I had not cried in the car in their driveway, or on the drive through their neighborhood, or when I stopped at the long red light on Millbrook that I always seemed to catch. But somewhere on the bridge over the river, in the rain, with the water below the same gray as the sky above, I cried. Not the kind of crying that announces itself, not sobs or gasping, but the quiet, leaking kind, the kind that happens when something has cost you enough that the body insists on acknowledging the bill. I cried for Caleb. Not the version of him who had sat across from me with rehearsed urgency, but the version I remembered, the small, serious boy who made me paper birthday cards because he thought store-bought ones were lazy, who called me every Sunday from college without fail. That boy still existed somewhere inside the man across the table from me. I believed that. I had to believe it, or the grief was too clean, and grief is never that clean. I also cried, I think, for the version of myself that wanted so badly to say yes. The woman who had spent 40 years solving problems, covering gaps, being the one who showed up. She wasn't gone. She was right there, inside me, arguing furiously that this was different, that this was her son, that the money was just money and family was supposed to matter more. I heard her. I let her make her case. And then I kept driving. Because here is what that version of me consistently refused to understand. Saying yes would not have fixed anything. Not really. It would have covered the immediate number, bought a temporary reprieve, and in doing so, confirmed everything. Confirmed that I was available to absorb the consequences of decisions made without me, that the warning they'd given me in October had no practical weight, that I could be told I was last and still be expected to act like I was first when it suited them. It would have confirmed, most devastatingly to myself, that I did not actually mean what I'd decided, that the legal pad full of intentions, the apartment sold, the investments made, the pottery class and the book group, and the small house with the linden tree, that all of it was provisional, available to be recalled in the event of emergency, subject to repossession by other people's needs. I had done that for 40 years. I pulled into my driveway and sat in the car until the rain slowed. Miriam came over that evening without being asked. I had sent her a brief text, talked to Caleb. It was hard. I'm okay. And she had responded by showing up at 7 with a bottle of wine and the particular expression she wore when she was prepared to listen for as long as necessary. We sat at my kitchen table and I told her all of it. She listened without interrupting, which is one of her gifts. And when I finished, she was quiet for a moment, swirling the wine in her glass. How did it feel? She asked, saying no. I thought about it seriously. Like both the hardest and most honest thing I've done in years, I said. Did you waver? When he said please, I paused. He said it in this voice, this specific voice he's had since he was a little kid when something scared him, and I pressed my fingers to my eyes for a moment. I felt it, Miriam. I felt the whole pull of it. I just didn't go with it this time. She nodded. She didn't say good or you were right or any of the validating things that would have felt hollow. She just nodded and refilled my glass and said, "That's different. That's a real thing." "I know." "It's not going to feel clean," she said. "It's not supposed to." "I know that too." We sat with that for a while, the two of us, with the rain gone now and the night quiet outside, and the particular domestic warmth of a kitchen where someone feels safe enough to fall apart in only the amounts they can manage. Caleb did not call for 6 days. When he did, it was brief and strange and harder to interpret than the angry call I'd half expected. He didn't bring up the money, didn't circle back to the arguments, didn't try a different approach. He just called to say he'd gotten Lily's school pictures back and thought I might want one. And was it okay if he mailed it, or would I prefer he dropped it off? I said he could drop it off. He came by on a Saturday afternoon, stayed exactly 20 minutes, looked around my house with an expression I couldn't entirely decode, something between taking inventory and the kind of helpless recognition that comes when the world has rearranged itself and you've only just understood that you weren't consulted. He said the house was nice. He asked about the linen tree. He gave me the school picture, Lily in a dark blue dress, gap-toothed and beaming, and I thanked him, and he left. I put the picture on my refrigerator, next to her drawing from when she was 3. Then I went into the backyard and stood under the linden tree for a while, in the December cold, with my coat pulled tight and my hands in my pockets, and I thought about what was happening. Not what had happened. What was happening, present tense, ongoing. Because this wasn't a story with a clean ending yet. Caleb and Vanessa were still in debt. The crisis was still real. I had not fixed it, and I had not promised to fix it, and I did not know how it would resolve. What I knew was this: I had held the boundary. Not perfectly. There had been wavering, there had been tears in the car, there had been moments where the old muscle memory surged hard, and I'd had to consciously push back against it. But I had held it. I had not been rescued into giving myself away again. That had to count for something, even if it didn't feel triumphant. Even if it felt like a cold December afternoon under a bare tree, with my granddaughter's picture on my refrigerator, and my son driving away down a street I didn't know the name of yet, because I'd only been here 8 weeks, and the neighborhood was still new to me. It had to count. The call I didn't expect came on a Tuesday morning, 20 minutes before I had to leave for ceramics. Not from Caleb, from Vanessa. She had never called me independently in all the years she'd been in my son's life. Our communication had always been mediated through Caleb, messages passed, arrangements made, pleasantries exchanged in his presence. A direct call from her felt so anomalous that I almost didn't answer, convinced for a moment I'd misread the screen. I answered. "Eleanor." Her voice was different from the last time I'd heard it, stripped of the careful management. What was left was not warm, exactly. It wasn't a warm call, and I'm not going to pretend it was. But it was real in a way our interactions rarely had been. "Vanessa," I said, "I wanted to—" She stopped. I heard her take a breath. "I wanted to say something to you without Caleb there." I waited. "I think I owe you an apology," she said. "Not for asking for help. I don't apologize for that. We were desperate, and you were the person we thought to call, and I would do it again in that situation. But the way I pushed, using Lily like that wasn't fair." I was quiet for a moment, absorbing. "I heard what you said," she continued, "about October, about what we told you, and I—" Another pause. "I knew when we said it that it was harsh. I told myself it was honest, that honesty was better than the alternative. But I think—" She stopped again, and this time the stop felt less like management and more like genuine difficulty. "I think I underestimated what it would cost you to hear it. I didn't think about that enough." The truth was that I hadn't expected this. I had prepared for many possible next moves. More pressure, a different approach. Vanessa finding a new angle through which to push the same door. I had not prepared for this. "Thank you," I said, because it was what was true. "I'm not asking you to change your answer," she said quickly. "I want to be clear about that. I'm not calling to try again. I'm calling because I said something I think I needed to say." "I hear that," I said. A brief silence, then, "For what it's worth, the house looks good. Caleb said there's a tree." "A linden," I said. "It's old. It's not going anywhere." Something shifted in her voice that might have been the beginning of something, or might have been nothing. It was hard to know yet. "Okay," she said. "Okay. Take care of yourself, Eleanor." "You too," I said. She hung up. I stood in my kitchen for a moment, phone in hand, the December light flat and pale through the window over the sink. Then I put the phone in my pocket, picked up my ceramics bag, and walked out to my car. I had a class to get to. The clay wasn't going to center itself, and I had learned over the past weeks that there were things I could control and things I could not, that the work in front of me was the only reliable place to put my hands, and that showing up consistently for the life I was in the middle of building was both the hardest and most necessary thing I knew how to do. I drove to the community center with the radio on and the heater running. I was not fixed. I was not at peace. I was 66 years old, and my son's life was in genuine trouble, and I had said no to the ask I'd spent 40 years saying yes to, and the aftermath of that was not resolution. It was just the uncertain, complicated, ongoing present. But I was still here, still choosing, still mine. And that, for today, was going to be enough. I left for New Orleans on a Thursday morning, 10 days after Vanessa's call. I want to be honest about what that departure felt like, because I think there's a version of this story where I describe walking through the airport with my rolling bag and my boarding pass and a heart full of clean, uncomplicated liberation. The older woman finally living her life, finally free, finally beginning. That version is tidier than what actually happened, so I won't tell it. What actually happened was that I checked my gate twice because I was convinced I'd misread the ticket. I sat in a terminal chair with my carry-on wedged between my feet and ate a bad airport sandwich and called Miriam to tell her I was there, which she already knew because I'd texted her from the parking shuttle, and she said, "Eleanor, you are allowed to just get on the plane." And she was right. I was making it complicated because some part of me was still waiting for the reason not to go. Still scanning for the emergency, the need, the person who would call and require something that would make this trip feel irresponsible. No one called. No emergency materialized. I got on the plane. New Orleans in December was not what I had imagined, which is to say it was better, messier, louder, and more alive than any imagined version of a place can ever quite be. The air was warm in the way that southern winter sometimes is. Not summer warm, but the kind of mild that feels like a gift after gray December rain. Like the city had decided to make an exception for you personally. The streets in the French Quarter smelled of food and old wood, and something I couldn't identify that I later decided was just the specific character of a place that has existed for a very long time and knows it. I had booked a small hotel on a side street 3 blocks from the river. The room had tall windows and plaster walls, and a ceiling fan that wobbled slightly at every rotation, and I stood at those windows on the first evening looking out at the street below. The lights just coming up, people moving in both directions, music audible from somewhere I couldn't locate. And I felt something shift very quietly inside my chest. Not joy, not exactly, something that comes before joy. The recognition that joy is possible, that the space for it exists. I ate dinner alone at a corner restaurant and ordered things I couldn't name and didn't regret. I walked until my feet hurt, then walked a little more. I bought a small piece of pottery from a woman selling things from a folding table. Irregular, handmade, with a glaze the color of old copper. And I thought of Greta and my Tuesday mornings, and the clay that had hit the work table, and the instruction to stop being polite with things. I was not being polite with this trip. I was in it completely, or trying to be, which is probably the most any of us can manage. The thing about traveling alone, when you are not used to it, is that it forces a particular kind of honesty. There is no one to defer to, no one whose preferences shape the day, no one to check in with about whether you're hungry or tired or ready to go. Every decision is yours, which sounds like freedom and is freedom, but freedom of that kind requires you to actually know what you want, and I was still learning that particular skill after a very long time of not practicing it. I made mistakes. I spent too long in a museum that didn't interest me because I'd read it was important and felt I should. I skipped a jazz performance on the second night because I was tired and told myself I'd go the next night and then didn't, which I still think about. I got briefly and embarrassingly lost on the fourth morning and had to ask a man walking a very large dog for directions, which he gave cheerfully and without condescension, which I found disproportionately moving. But I also did things that were exactly right. I took a long boat tour on the river and sat at the front and watched the city from the water and didn't take a single photograph, just looked. I found a bookshop in a converted house that had cats sleeping on the shelves and spent 3 hours there and bought 4 books and felt not 1 second of guilt about the time or the money. I sat in a square on the 4th afternoon with a cup of coffee and a book I wasn't really reading, watching pigeons and tourists and a street performer doing something complicated with juggling pins, and I thought, I am here. I am exactly here, doing nothing important, and it is enough. That sounds small. It was enormous. I called Miriam from a park bench on the 3rd evening. The sky was going orange over the rooftops, and there was a street musician somewhere nearby playing something slow and low that fit the light exactly. "How is it?" she asked. "I keep waiting for it to feel wrong," I said. "It doesn't." "Good." "It feels like I keep thinking of things I should be worried about, and then I realize I'm not actually worried about them. I just have the habit of worrying." Miriam said. "Habits are hard. 40 years is a long time to practice a habit." "It is," she said. "But you're here. You're in New Orleans on a Thursday night with, what's that music?" "Street musician. I don't know what it is. Whatever it is, it sounds like you made the right call." I looked at the orange sky for a moment. "Yeah," I said. "I think I did." I came home on a Sunday evening to a house that smelled faintly of the cedar sachets I'd put in the closets, and the particular neutral quiet of a space that has been closed and still. I set my bag down in the entryway and stood there for a moment, taking stock. The house was mine. The quiet was mine. The choice to stand in it, or fill it, or open the windows to the cold December air was mine. I opened the windows anyway, briefly, just to let the night in. Then I unpacked, put the copper-glazed pottery on the windowsill in the kitchen where it caught the light, and made tea. There were 2 voicemails from Caleb. I listened to them, brief, surface level, checking in, and decided I would call him tomorrow. Not because I was avoiding him, but because I had just walked in the door from my first solo trip in 40 years, and I was not yet ready to step back into that particular conversation. I was allowed to need a night. I took the night. January arrived with the specific bleakness that month always carries. The holidays dismantled, the decorations gone, the world returning to its ordinary face after weeks of performing festivity. My neighborhood looked gray and slightly deflated, the way January neighborhoods do, but my linden tree had a quality of bare, patient dignity that I found I liked. It was not trying to be anything other than what it was, standing there stripped of leaves, waiting without apparent distress for the season to change. I thought about that tree more than was probably reasonable. Ceramics resumed the 2nd Tuesday of the month. I walked back into Greta's studio smelling of earth and mineral heat, and Patricia was already there with 2 coffees and an expression that said she had things to tell me. "Good trip?" she asked. "Very good trip." "You look different," she said, tilting her head slightly. "Different how?" She considered. "Less like someone waiting for permission." I laughed, actually laughed, which surprised me slightly. "Sit down," Patricia said, handing me a coffee. "I did something while you were gone." She had signed up for a solo walking tour in Portugal for March. 5 days, guided, small group. She said it with the combination of excitement and mild terror I recognized as the exact feeling of doing something you've decided to stop waiting for. "Patricia," I said. "I know." "Good for you." "I've been thinking about what you said," she told me, "about how it takes so long to give yourself permission. And I thought if Eleanor can go to New Orleans at 66... "I'm 66, not dead," I said. "That's literally what I mean," she said, and raised her coffee cup. Greta appeared at the studio door and looked at us with the patient amusement of someone who has grown accustomed to her Tuesday morning class being equal parts ceramics and group therapy. "When you're both ready," she said. We went in and made things with our hands, and the morning was ordinary and good, and I thought, this is what it looks like. This is what a life that belongs to you looks like. Not dramatic, not transformed, just ordinary and good and yours. The book group in January had chosen a novel about a woman who inherits a house from a grandmother she barely knew, and spends the book learning who the grandmother actually was through the objects left behind. Joyce thought it was a meditation on legacy. Harold thought it was sentimental. I thought they were both right, and said so, which pleased Joyce and annoyed Harold, which seemed to be the natural order of things. After the session, a man I had noticed but not yet spoken to approached me as I was gathering my coat. His name, he told me, was Daniel Mercer. He was 68, recently widowed, 14 months, he said, with the precision of someone who still counts. And he had joined the book group in November at his daughter's insistence because she was worried he was spending too much time alone with his thoughts, which he acknowledged was probably fair. He was not particularly tall and had the kind of face that had clearly done a good deal of living without trying to hide it. Lined around the eyes, slightly weathered, with a quality of attention when he listened to you that I recognized as something I'd stopped expecting from people and had therefore stopped noticing its absence. I liked what you said, he told me. About the book. Which part? The part about how both things can be true at once. He paused. I find that's an underrated position. Most people want it to be one or the other, I said. Easier to argue that way, Gato, he said, but usually wrong. I looked at him for a moment. He looked back without any of the particular calculation men sometimes deploy in those situations. No performance, no angle, just genuine curiosity. The kind that meets you where you actually are, instead of where it might be more convenient for you to be. I'm Eleanor, I said, even though we'd been introduced in the group. I know, he said. Daniel. I know, I said. We walked out of the library at the same time and stood on the front steps for a moment in the January cold, and he asked if I'd read the next selection yet, and I said I'd started it on the plane coming back from New Orleans, and he said he didn't know I'd been traveling, and I said I'd just started doing that, and he said, in a tone that was entirely without agenda, "Any good?" "Very," I said. "You should go." "Maybe," he said. He smiled, a small one, not performed. "Good night, Eleanor." "Good night," I said. I drove home thinking about the quality of attention in his face when he listened. How long it had been since someone had listened to me that way. Not to figure out what I needed, not to assess how my needs aligned with theirs, but simply because they were interested in what I was saying. It was such a small thing. I couldn't stop thinking about it. Caleb called on a Wednesday evening in late January. I knew before I answered that something significant had happened. There was a register to his recent calls I had learned to read. The careful checking in calls versus the ones that carried weight. This one had weight. "The business is done," he said without preamble. "We couldn't make January. The loan went to collections. We're working with a bankruptcy attorney." I sat down on the edge of my bed. "I'm sorry, Caleb." "Are you?" His voice wasn't cruel. It was exhausted, and underneath the exhaustion was something that might have been genuine curiosity. "Yes," I said. "I am. Whatever you think of my decisions, I never wanted this for you." A long silence. "We're going to lose the house," he said. "We're trying to figure out. There are options. The attorney says there are options, but right now it's not. It's not clear what happens next." I thought about Lily. I thought about the photograph on my refrigerator, gap-toothed and beaming. I thought about what I could and could not do, and the line between them, which I had learned was not a cruel line but a necessary one. "Where will you go?" I asked. "Vanessa's parents have a rental property," he said, "in Millbrook. We'll probably go there for a while, until we can figure things out." Vanessa's parents. Of course. The primary family, doing what primary families do, catching the ones they've designated as theirs. I thought of October, the kitchen table, the refrigerator humming. Vanessa's family will always come first. I thought about how that sentence had felt when he said it and what it felt like now, on the other side of everything, holding the shape of what it had meant in practice. "That's good," I said, and meant it. "That's good that they can help." Another silence. "Mom," his voice changed. The exhaustion was still there, but something else had moved underneath it. Something that sounded like the beginning of a much harder conversation than the one we'd been having. "I need to say something to you." I waited. I've been seeing someone. A therapist." He said it quickly, like removing a bandage. "Since November. Vanessa suggested it, and I fought it for about 3 weeks, and then I went, and I've been going every week since." I didn't say anything. I wasn't sure what to say. "She's been asking me a lot of questions about you," he continued. "About us. About the things I said in October and why I said them and what I thought I was doing." He paused. "I don't have good answers yet. I'm working on it. But I wanted you to know I'm working on it." I sat very still on the edge of my bed with the phone in my hand and the January dark outside my window and the linden tree standing in the yard below, patient and bare, and not going anywhere. "Caleb, that's good," I said carefully. "That matters." "I'm not calling to ask for anything," he said. "I want to be clear about that. This isn't a setup for something else. I think I needed you to know." "I hear you," I said. "I think I've been—" He stopped and started again, and I could hear him working for the words, finding them slowly. "I think I've been unfair to you for a long time. Not on purpose. I don't think it was on purpose, but I'm starting to understand that not on purpose doesn't mean it didn't happen." The refrigerator in my kitchen hummed, faintly, from down the hall. Strange how that sound kept finding me at the important moments. "I know," I said quietly. "I'm sorry, Mom." A pause. "I'm not asking you to accept that right now. I know it doesn't fix things. I needed to say it." I breathed in, out, the kind of breathing that is also a form of thinking. "Thank you," I said. Not "it's fine," which would have been the old reflex, the smoothing over, the making it easier for him than the moment deserved. Just thank you. For saying it. For beginning the work. We talked for 20 more minutes about ordinary things. Lily's school, a book he'd started reading, the rental property in Millbrook. The ordinary surface conversation of people who have said something significant and need time to let it settle before they can say anything more. I understood that. I was willing to give it time. We hung up and I sat on the edge of the bed for a while in the quiet. I didn't know what it meant yet, his apology and his therapy and his careful, effortful beginning. I didn't know if it would hold or what it would become or what I would be willing to rebuild and on what terms. Those were questions for later, for the slow work of consistent action over time, which is the only currency that actually counts when trust has been spent down to nothing. But he had said it. He had started. And I, for the first time in a long time, was in a position where I could afford to wait and see. Not because I was desperate for reconciliation, not because I needed him to value me in order to value myself, but because I was whole enough now to consider it from a place of choice rather than hunger. That was new. That was genuinely new. Mom, Daniel Mercer and I had coffee for the first time on a Saturday morning in February, at a small place near the library that served excellent coffee and had tables far enough apart that you could have a real conversation without performing it for the whole room. It had come about naturally, which is the only way such things should come about. A conversation after book group the previous week that ran long into the parking lot, under a cold, clear sky until we'd both noticed that we'd been standing in the cold for 40 minutes, and neither of us had moved toward our cars. "We could continue this somewhere warmer," he'd said. "We could," I said. "Saturday?" "Saturday works." It was not a date exactly, or rather, the word date carried a weight I wasn't prepared to assign to it, so I didn't. It was just two people who had found each other interesting, meeting for coffee, which is a perfectly ordinary human thing that does not require categorization. He arrived before I did, which I appreciated. He had a coffee already in front of him and a book face down on the table and the comfortable, settled quality of a man who knows how to wait without making waiting feel like a reproach. We talked for 2 hours. not about our losses. Or not primarily, not in the extractive way that grief sometimes makes people interact with each other, trading wounds as credentials. We talked about books, which given the context was inevitable, and then about the town we'd both ended up in and how long we'd been here, and his daughter who lived in the city and his son who lived in Colorado and had 3 dogs he sent photographs of with an enthusiasm that Daniel found both endearing and slightly excessive. 3 dogs seems like a commitment, I said. He says they're a family, Daniel said. I say he's working very hard to avoid something, but I haven't figured out what yet. I laughed. You have a son, he said. It wasn't a question. He'd absorbed things from book group the way people do. 1 son, I said, and a granddaughter. I paused, considering how much to say and deciding on something close to honest. It's been a complicated year with him. We're trying to figure out what the relationship looks like going forward. Neither of us fully knows yet. Daniel nodded. Not with the pity I sometimes got when I said things like this, and not with the brisk advice-giving mode that some people defaulted to, as if a problem named was a problem requiring their immediate solution, just a nod of genuine recognition. My wife and I had a complicated last few years, he said. Before she died. We'd worked through most of it, I think, but not all. And now I carry the rest of it, the unresolved part, because there's no one left to resolve it with. I'm sorry, I said. Don't be. It's just true. He looked at his coffee. I suppose I'm saying I understand complicated, and I think sometimes the complicated things are the ones that are actually real versus the ones that only look simple because no one's looked closely yet. I sat with that. That's a remarkably honest thing to say to someone you've had coffee with for 90 minutes, I said. He looked up, and the small smile again. The real one. Unperformed. I'm 68, he said. I've run out of time for the alternative. I thought, yes, that is exactly right. I thought, here is a person who has also arrived by whatever path at the same understanding that at a certain point in life, the luxury of indirection simply costs too much. Agreed, I said. We ordered more coffee. The conversation shifted, moved through other territories, lighter and darker by turns. By the time we walked out into the February afternoon, 2.5 hours had passed in the way that time passes when it's being well spent. Not flying, not dragging, just moving at the pace of something that has both people's full attention. He walked me to my car. Next week's book group, he said. I'll be there, I said. Good. He paused. Eleanor. Daniel. I enjoyed this. So did I. He walked back toward his own car, and I sat in mine for a moment before starting the engine, the February light bright and cold on the windshield, the ordinary afternoon carrying on around me. I was not swept away. I was not transformed. I was a 66-year-old woman who had just had a very good conversation with someone who listened the way I'd forgotten people could listen, and I felt, carefully, without rushing toward it, without needing it to be more than it was, the tentative beginning of something I hadn't expected to find. Not rescue, not replacement, something quieter and more honest than either of those things. The willingness to be seen. March arrived and Patricia left for Portugal. She sent me a photograph on the 3rd day. Herself on a cobblestone street in the early morning light, her hair slightly wind-messed, squinting slightly into the camera she'd turned on herself, grinning with the unguarded happiness of someone who has found the exact right place for the exact right moment. I put it on my refrigerator next to Lily's school photo and the drawing from when she was 3. My refrigerator was becoming a record of things that mattered. Not arranged, not curated, just accumulated, the way real things accumulate in a real life. Evidence of people I loved and moments that had meant something. The record of a woman who was still here, still adding to the collection. That same week, I took my first piece of finished pottery home from the studio. It was a small bowl, not a vase or a plate or anything ambitious, just a bowl, low and wide, with walls that were slightly uneven because my hands were still learning. The glaze had gone a deep blue-green that surprised me, richer than I'd expected, the kind of color that changes slightly depending on the light and the angle. Greta had set it on the shelf for me when it came out of the kiln, and when I came in on Tuesday, she pointed at it without saying anything, just pointed, and I walked over and picked it up and held it. "Well," I said. "Well," she agreed. "It was mine. I had made it with my hands, imperfectly, and it was mine." I put it on the windowsill in the kitchen, next to the copper-glazed piece from New Orleans, and I stood there looking at the two of them for a moment, the bought thing and the made thing, side by side in the afternoon light. There was a life assembling itself on that windowsill, a small one, specific and quiet, built from the particular raw materials of a woman who had decided, not all at once but day by day, that what remained of her time was worth treating as something precious. Outside, the linden tree had begun, quietly and without announcement, to bud. I hadn't noticed until that moment. I stood at the window and looked at the branches, and there they were. The first small insistence of green, the tree beginning its return, patient as it had always been, arriving exactly on schedule. I was not done with difficulty. I knew that. The call with Caleb had been a beginning, not a resolution, and beginnings require tending, slow, inconsistent, sometimes discouraging work, with setbacks built in and no guaranteed outcome. Daniel and I had coffee once a week now, and I didn't know what it was yet and didn't need to know, which was itself a kind of progress. Patricia was in Portugal, and I was here, and Miriam had started calling me on Wednesday evenings just to check in. Not because she was worried, but because we had discovered we liked it, which is a different and better reason. The grief was still there. It lives somewhere in the body, grief does. Not in one place you could locate and address, but distributed, woven in, part of the texture of the life that carries it. The loss of the son I'd imagined I had. The loss of the decades I'd organized around a version of love that turned out to be largely one-directional. The loss of Robert, always Robert, that oldest and most fundamental absence that everything else had grown around. You don't get over those things. You grow around them, the way trees grow around obstacles. Not ignoring them, not defined by them, but incorporating them into the shape of what you become. I was still becoming something. At 66, in a house with a linden tree and a blue-green bowl on the windowsill and a refrigerator covered in evidence of a life that was still, improbably, accumulating meaning. The tree was budding, spring was coming, and I was here to see it. The linden tree was fully green by the time Caleb asked if he could come over alone. Not to talk about money, not to negotiate or explain or request. Just to come over, he said, and sit with me for a while if I was willing. The way he phrased it, if you're willing, was new. It was the phrasing of someone who has started to understand that other people's willingness is not a given, that it has to be asked for, and that asking means accepting the possibility of no. I told him yes. Saturday afternoon. I'd make coffee. He arrived 10 minutes late, which is unlike him. Caleb has always been precise about time, one of those people who treat punctuality as a form of respect. And when I opened the door, he looked like a man who had been sitting in his car in my driveway, working up to something. There was a quality to him I hadn't seen in a long time, a stripped-down quality, like he'd taken off several layers of the careful management he'd been wearing for years and hadn't quite figured out what to do with his hands without them. "Come in," I said. He came in. He looked around the house, really looked this time, not the quick inventory scan of his December visit, but the slower looking of someone trying to understand a place. He looked at the linden tree through the kitchen window. He looked at the windowsill with the blue-green bowl and the copper piece from New Orleans. He looked at the refrigerator, the photographs, Lily's drawing, Patricia in Portugal on a cobblestone street, and stood in front of it for a moment without saying anything. I poured coffee, set the cups on the table, sat down. He sat across from me, and for a moment neither of us spoke, which would have been unbearable 8 months ago and was now simply the necessary space before something true. "I've been in therapy for 4 months," he said. "I know. You told me." "I know I told you." He wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. "I wanted to tell you what I've been learning, if that's okay." "It's okay," I said. He looked at the table, then at me. "I think I learned to treat you as permanent," he said. Not like I valued you. Permanent like infrastructure. Like you'd always be there, always have something to give, always absorb whatever happened, and none of that required my attention or my gratitude because it just was. Like electricity, You don't thank the wiring." The room was very quiet. "My therapist asked me when the last time I told you I was grateful was," he continued, "a specific time, a real occasion." His jaw tightened slightly. "I couldn't remember one. I've been trying to think of one since she asked, and Mom, I can't find one." I didn't fill the silence. That was also new, letting him stay in it rather than rescuing him from the discomfort of what he'd said. "I told you you'd always be last," he said. "I sat across from you at my kitchen table and I said that. And the worst part is, I thought I was doing you a kindness. I thought I was being honest, managing expectations, being clear about reality. I told myself I was helping." He shook his head. "I wasn't helping. I was telling my mother she was worth less to me than I'd let her believe, and then feeling good about my own honesty." I looked at my son. This person I had carried through a thunderstorm into the world. This person I had sold my mother's earrings for and turned down promotions for and spent Christmases alone for. I looked at him, the lines in his face that weren't there 10 years ago, the shadows that weren't just from bad sleep, the particular effortfulness of a person trying to say a true thing they've been avoiding for a very long time. "Caleb," I said, "I need to ask you something." He looked up. "Is this because of the business? Because things fell apart, and you need me to be back in your life in the old way?" The question hung in the air. I needed to ask it. I needed to know the answer was real, and the only way to know was to put the possibility on the table and watch what he did with it. He didn't flinch. He didn't look away. "No," he said. "No, it's not, and I understand why you asked. I would ask too." He paused. "The business was a consequence. The thing I'm sorry for is older than the business. It's older than October. It goes back further than I've been comfortable admitting, and I'm still working through how far back it goes. But it's not about money. I'm not here to ask you for money." I watched his face for a long moment. He held my gaze. Steady. "Okay," I said finally. "Okay?" He looked uncertain, like he'd been braced for more. "Okay, I hear you. I believe you meant what you said just now." I wrapped my hands around my own cup. "That's not the same as everything being resolved. I need you to understand that. An apology is a beginning, not an ending. What comes after it is what matters." He nodded. "My therapist says the same thing." "Your therapist is right." Something moved across his face. Not quite a smile, but the precursor to one. The particular expression of a person who has been caught agreeing with someone they should have been listening to for years. "I know," he said. We sat together in my kitchen for another hour. We talked about ordinary things. We talked about Lily, who had started asking questions about why they'd moved and was processing it with the pragmatic resilience of a 5-year-old who has not yet learned to be ashamed of needing to understand things. We talked about Caleb's job search. He'd found contract work that wasn't what he'd imagined for himself, but was steadier than the venture had ever been. We talked about the linden tree. He left in the late afternoon, and I walked him to the door, and he stopped on the porch and turned back to look at me with that stripped-down quality still in his face. "Mom," he said, "thank you for letting me come." "Thank you for asking instead of assuming," I said. He drove away. I stood on the porch in the April light and breathed the particular air of a season that is still deciding what it wants to be, warm in the sun and cool in the shade, and I thought, this is what the beginning of repair looks like. Not reunion, not the restoration of something to its prior condition, something new, built differently, on ground that's been cleared of the false assumptions that undermine the original structure. It might hold. It might not hold completely. But it was being built honestly, and that was more than I had believed possible 6 months ago. Vanessa called the following week, and this time it was not to apologize and not to ask anything. It was to say that Lily had been asking about me, specifically and repeatedly, and would I want to come to Lily's spring concert at school on a Thursday evening in May. Her class is singing, Vanessa said. 3 songs. It's approximately 22 minutes, and then there are cookies in the gymnasium, and Lily has been practicing one particular part of one particular song for 2 weeks, and it's all she talks about. I thought about October, the parties I hadn't been invited to, The Tuesday and Thursday schedule that was Helen's territory. The word your role delivered across a kitchen table. I thought about Vanessa on the phone in December, saying that wasn't fair. About Caleb in my kitchen last Saturday, saying I couldn't remember one. I'll be there, I said. She'll be glad, Vanessa said, and then, in a slightly different register, the one where the management drops away. I think it'll be good for her to see you there. I think so too, I said. The concert was exactly as advertised. 22 minutes, small chairs, a gymnasium that smelled of floor wax and old sneakers, parents crammed into rows with their phones raised. I sat between Caleb and an empty seat that had a jacket on it belonging to Helen's husband, who arrived 3 minutes late and apologized to everyone within 6 feet. Lily came out with her class in a line, wearing a white shirt and the expression of a child who is trying very hard not to look for her people in the audience, which is to say she was scanning the audience immediately. She found Caleb first, then Vanessa, then Helen, and then she found me, and her face did something I will carry with me for the rest of my life. Not a performance, not the polished excitement of a child who knows they're being watched, but genuine and unguarded surprise that collapsed immediately into a joy so complete it looked almost like relief. She waved at me with her whole arm. I waved back with mine. The child next to her grabbed her sleeve to get her back in line, and she straightened up, still grinning, and the concert began. She sang the particular part of the particular song she'd been practicing for 2 weeks, with the focused intensity of someone who understands this is the one moment that counts. It was not perfect. She came in slightly early on the third verse and recovered with a quick, barely perceptible pause that probably only I noticed because I was watching her with the specific attention you only give to people you love. Afterward, in the gymnasium, with the cookies and the noise and the particular organized chaos of small children released from performance back into their ordinary selves, Lily found me within 30 seconds of being allowed to move. She wrapped both arms around my waist and held on. I held on back. "Grandma," she said, muffled against my shirt. "Hi, sweet girl." She pulled back and looked up at me with the directness that 5-year-olds have not yet learned to filter. "Why haven't you been coming?" she asked. The gymnasium noise carried on around us. I crouched down to her level. "Things got complicated for a while," I said. "But I'm here now." She considered this with the grave practicality of a child processing information. "Are you coming to my birthday?" she asked. "When is your birthday?" "July," she said, with the emphasis of someone who finds it extraordinary that this information is not universally known. "Then I'll be at your birthday," I said. She nodded, apparently satisfied, and then grabbed my hand and dragged me toward the cookie table with the cheerful authority of someone who has decided the matter is settled and moved on. I let her drag me. I ate a cookie that was slightly stale and decorated with a frosting star. I stood in a loud gymnasium in May and held my granddaughter's hand, and the feeling of it was not clean or triumphant or complete. It was complicated and tender and absolutely real, which is the only kind of good thing that lasts. Chet, I want to talk to you now, directly, honestly, because this is where I've been going with all of this. Not to arrive at a tidy ending, not to tie it into a bow and tell you everything worked out perfectly. Because it didn't, and it hasn't, and I think the moment a story tells you it did, it's lying to you about the most important parts. What I want to tell you is what I learned. Not the lessons you get from someone else's life, packaged and summarized and handed over like instructions. The ones I earned through the specific, grinding, unglamorous work of living through a thing rather than around it. The first thing is this: the people who love you well do not make you disappear. I know that sounds obvious. Written down, it sounds like something you'd read on a wall calendar and think, yes, obviously, and move on. But living it is different from knowing it. Because when love is tangled up with need, when someone has needed you so completely and for so long that the needing starts to look like love, it is genuinely difficult to see the difference. I confused being needed with being valued for most of my adult life. I mistook indispensability for love. And those two things look similar from a distance, but from the inside they feel completely different. One expands you, and the other slowly reduces you to the size of what someone else requires. Real love, the kind worth having, the kind worth building a life around, has room for you in it. It asks what you want. It remembers that your time and your body and your money and your future belong to you, and it doesn't require you to surrender those things as the price of admission. If someone tells you that you will always be last, believe them. Not because they are terrible people, but because they are telling you the truth about how they have organized their world, and you deserve to make your decisions based on accurate information. The second thing is about money, because I know some of you are sitting with that part of the story and turning it over, wondering if I was wrong not to help Caleb when he needed it. I understand that question. I asked it myself, in the car on the bridge in the December rain, crying the quiet leaking kind of tears that aren't about drama, but about cost. Here's what I know. Money that you give from love freely offered is a gift. Money that you give because you are afraid of being abandoned, or because you've been told you owe it, or because you have been made to feel that your value to the people you love is contingent on what you can provide. That is not a gift. That is a ransom. And the tragedy of paying ransoms is that they don't buy you what they promise. They only establish the price. I gave for 40 years. I gave until there was almost nothing left of the woman who had once had wants of her own. And my giving did not make Caleb treat me as essential. It made him treat me as guaranteed. There is a difference, and it took me 66 years to understand it clearly. Protect your future, not out of selfishness, out of dignity, because you worked for it, because you earned it, because you are a person whose later years are worth something, whose comfort matters, whose security is not a luxury but a right. No one is coming to protect it for you. You have to do that yourself. The third thing is the hardest one to say, because it requires admitting something about myself rather than something about Caleb or Vanessa, or the long architecture of choices that led us to that kitchen table in October. I participated in my own disappearance, not consciously, not because I didn't know better or because someone held a gun to my head. I did it out of love, yes, but also out of fear. Fear that if I stopped being useful, I would stop being wanted. Fear that setting limits would mean losing connection. Fear that a need of my own, stated plainly, would be heard as a demand and resented. So I made myself smaller. I asked for less. I tolerated exclusions I should have named. I smoothed things over when I should have let them stay rough long enough to be reckoned with. I told myself I was being generous, and some of it was generosity, but some of it was fear wearing generosity's clothes. I'm not saying this to blame myself. Blame is not useful here. I'm saying it because I think some of you know exactly what I mean, and I think you have been telling yourself the same story I told myself, that you are choosing sacrifice freely, that love means giving without limit, that your needs are smaller than other people's needs, and should therefore wait. They shouldn't wait. They have been waiting long enough. The woman on the other side of that waiting, the one who shows up for ceramics on Tuesday mornings, who goes to New Orleans alone, who holds her granddaughter's hand at a school concert in May, who sits across from a man who listens the way she'd forgotten people could listen. That woman was always there. She did not need to be created. She only needed to be chosen. Choose her. Choose yourself. Not instead of love, but inside it. Real love is big enough to hold that. And if someone's love isn't big enough to hold your wholeness, that tells you something important about whether what they're offering is actually love or something else wearing its name. It is summer now. Daniel and I had dinner last Friday at a restaurant we chose together, neither of us deferring to the other about where to go, both of us ordering what we actually wanted and talking until the restaurant had half emptied around us without our noticing. He is not a perfect person. He has a tendency to over-explain things he finds interesting, which can occasionally make me want to redirect the conversation with more force than is probably polite. He is also kind in the specific way that consistently kind people are kind. Not as a performance, but as a habit so deep it's become indistinguishable from character. I don't know exactly what we are yet. I have decided that's all right. Lily's birthday party is in 3 weeks. I have been invited, properly invited, asked directly. Included in the planning in a small way when Vanessa called last Tuesday to check whether Lily's requested butterfly theme was something I was willing to get on board with, which made me laugh, actually laugh, in a way that surprised us both. I'm fully on board with butterflies, I said. Good, Vanessa said. She'll be glad to know you're coming. It was not a transformation. Vanessa and I are not friends, and may never be. and I have made my peace with that particular shape of things. What we are is two people who have chosen, carefully and without illusion, to behave well toward each other for the sake of a child we both love. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, quite a lot. Caleb and I talk on Sundays now. He calls, I answer. Sometimes the conversations are easy, and sometimes they are stilted, and sometimes he says something that reveals how much work is still ahead. An old assumption surfacing, an unexamined thing momentarily visible, and I name it quietly rather than letting it pass. He is learning to hear me do that without becoming defensive, which is its own kind of progress. I do not know what we will become. I have stopped needing to know in advance. What I know is that the relationship being built now is more honest than the one that existed before, because it is built on the actual truth of who we are to each other, rather than the comfortable fiction we had both been maintaining. That truth is harder to live in. It is also the only ground solid enough to build anything real on. Miriam had coffee with me this morning, in my kitchen, at my table, with the linden tree doing its full summer extravagance outside the window. Leaves so dense and green they seem almost improbable, as if the tree is making up for the months it spent bare and patient. "You look like yourself," she said, stirring her coffee. "I think I finally am," I said. She looked at me for a moment with the particular quality of a friend of 40 years. The look that has decades of context behind it, that knows the before and the after, and the cost of the distance between them. "It took long enough," she said. "It did," I agreed. She raised her cup. I raised mine. Outside, the linden tree moved in a small wind, and the light shifted through the leaves the way light does in summer. Unstable and generous and briefly exactly beautiful. I have been last. I have been invisible. I have been the person who absorbs and adjusts and makes herself available and waits, always waits, for the recognition that kept not coming. I have given away decades of myself in the hope that love freely offered would return in kind. And I have learned, at 66, under a linden tree, with a blue-green bowl on my windowsill and a granddaughter who waves with her whole arm, that the life I was waiting for permission to live was mine all along. I didn't need to earn it. I didn't need to be chosen by anyone else first. I only needed to stop abandoning myself and start showing up, consistently and without apology, for the woman I had always been underneath everything I'd allowed to cover her. If you're somewhere in the middle of a story like this one, if you are sitting at someone else's kitchen table being told where you rank, or driving home in the rain after saying yes one more time when your whole body was saying no, or lying awake counting all the years you've spent making yourself smaller to fit the space someone else decided you deserved, I want you to hear this. It is not too late. Whatever age you are, whatever has already been given away, whatever the voice in your head says about what you owe and what you've forfeited, and how selfish it would be to want things for yourself, it is not too late. The wanting is not selfish. The wanting is the most human thing about you, and the life on the other side of choosing yourself is not perfect. I'm not going to lie to you and say that it is, but it is yours. Fully, finally, irreversibly yours. That is everything. That is more than enough.